Marcus Thompson was the kind of guy who always thought he was the smartest person in the room. At 28 years old, he worked as a marketing manager for a tech company in London, and he had developed quite the reputation among his friends for his sharp tongue and quick jokes. Marcus loved being the center of attention, especially when it meant getting a laugh at someone else's expense. On a bright Tuesday morning in June, Marcus decided to take a different route to work. Instead of his usual underground commute, he chose to walk through central London, hoping to clear his head before an important presentation. The sun was shining, tourists were already gathering around the famous landmarks, and Marcus felt particularly confident about the day ahead. As he strolled down the street, his phone buzzed with messages from his college friends in their group chat. They were planning a weekend trip and sharing funny videos they had found online. Marcus loved these moments when he could show off his wit and humor. He was always the one who came up with the best jokes and the most clever comments. His friend, Jake, had just shared a video of someone attempting to make one of the royal guards at Buckingham Palace laugh or break character. The video showed a tourist doing silly dances and making funny faces, but the guard remained perfectly still and serious. The comments in the group chat were full of people saying how impressive it was that the guards never moved or reacted to anything. Marcus typed back quickly, "Those guys are just standing there like statues. I bet I could get one of them to crack up in under 5 minutes. They're probably bored out of their minds anyway." His friends responded with laughing emojis and challenged him to try it sometime. The more Marcus thought about it, the more the idea appealed to him. He had always been good at making people laugh, even in the most serious situations. During college, he was known for his ability to lighten the mood during stressful exam periods. His co-workers often relied on him to break the tension during difficult meetings with his perfectly timed jokes and impressions. As he continued his walk toward his office, Marcus found himself taking a slight detour that would lead him past one of the locations where royal guards were stationed. He told himself he was just curious, but deep down he was already planning his approach. He imagined how impressed his friends would be when he shared a video of himself successfully making a royal guard break character. Marcus had grown up in a middle-class family where humor was always appreciated. His father was known in their neighborhood for his funny stories and quick wit, and Marcus had inherited that same confidence in his comedic abilities. Throughout his school years, he had been the class clown, always ready with a joke or a funny observation that would get his classmates laughing. However, Marcus had a tendency to take his jokes too far sometimes. In high school, he had gotten into trouble a few times for making fun of teachers or other students in ways that crossed the line from funny to mean. His parents had tried to teach him about respecting others, but Marcus often justified his behavior by saying he was just trying to make people smile. As an adult, this pattern had continued in more subtle ways. At work, Marcus was well liked by most of his colleagues, but there were a few incidents where his jokes had made people uncomfortable. He had a habit of targeting anyone he perceived as too serious or uptight, believing that his humor was helping them loosen up. The royal guards, in Marcus's mind, represented the ultimate challenge. These were people who were trained to remain completely professional and unmovable, no matter what happened around them. To Marcus, they seemed almost inhuman in their dedication to their duty, and he found this both fascinating and slightly annoying. He had read articles about how the guards were selected and trained, how they had to meet strict physical and mental requirements, and how they took their responsibilities very seriously. But instead of feeling respect for their dedication, Marcus saw it as an opportunity to prove his own cleverness and humor. As he approached the area where he knew he would encounter a royal guard, Marcus felt a familiar rush of excitement. This was the same feeling he got before delivering a big presentation at work or telling a joke at a party. He was confident in his abilities and sure that he could succeed where others had failed. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the camera app, planning to record whatever happened. He wanted to capture the moment when he successfully made the guard laugh or react so he could share it with his friends and maybe even post it online. He imagined the likes and comments he would get, people praising his boldness and humor, What Marcus didn't realize was that his plan was about to set in motion a series of events that would completely change his perspective on respect, professionalism, and the consequences of his actions. He was walking into a situation that would teach him lessons he had somehow managed to avoid learning throughout his entire life. The morning air was crisp and fresh as Marcus rounded the corner, his confidence high and his phone ready to record. He had no idea that within the next few hours, his understanding of humor, respect, and personal responsibility would be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. The stage was set for an encounter that would become a turning point in his life, though Marcus was far too focused on his immediate goal to realize the significance of what was about to unfold. Marcus turned the corner and immediately spotted his target. Standing at attention outside a government building was a royal guard in full ceremonial uniform. The guard was young, probably in his early 20s, with a perfectly pressed red tunic, black trousers, and the iconic bearskin hat that made him appear even taller and more imposing than he actually was. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though Marcus had no way of knowing this. James had been serving as a royal guard for just over 2 years, and he took his duty extremely seriously. He came from a military family where service and honor were deeply valued traditions. His grandfather had served in World War II. His father had been a career soldier, and James had grown up hearing stories about the importance of discipline, respect, and representing something bigger than yourself. James had worked incredibly hard to earn his position. The selection process had been grueling, involving months of physical training, psychological evaluations, and rigorous testing of his ability to remain focused and professional under pressure. He had competed against hundreds of other candidates, and only a small percentage had been chosen to serve in this prestigious role. For James, standing guard wasn't just a job, it was an honor and a responsibility that he carried with tremendous pride. He understood that he represented centuries of British military tradition and that tourists and locals alike looked to him as a symbol of stability and professionalism. Every day he put on his uniform, James reminded himself that he was part of something much larger than his individual identity. Marcus approached with his phone held discreetly at his side, already recording. He started about 10 feet away from James, speaking in a loud, exaggerated voice. "Wow, look at this guy, standing there like a robot. I bet he doesn't even know what year it is." A few tourists nearby turned to look, some smiling at Marcus's comment, others seeming uncomfortable with his approach. James heard every word, but his training kicked in automatically. He had been prepared for exactly this type of situation. During his training, instructors had taught him how to mentally filter out distractions and maintain his focus regardless of what was happening around him. He had practiced standing at attention for hours while instructors shouted at him, made loud noises, and tried various tactics to break his concentration. Encouraged by what he perceived as success, Marcus moved closer and got more animated. He started making exaggerated military salutes in front of James, speaking in a mock-serious voice. "Sir, yes, sir. Permission to ask why you're dressed like you're going to a costume party, sir." He looked around at the gathering crowd, pleased to see that some people were laughing and pulling out their own phones to record. Marcus began doing a silly march back and forth in front of James, lifting his knees high and swinging his arms, dramatically. "This is how you're supposed to walk, right? Very serious, very important." He made exaggerated facial expressions and continued his commentary. "I wonder if they wind him up in the morning like a toy soldier." Several tourists were now watching the scene unfold. Some were laughing and encouraging Marcus, while others looked uncomfortable and began to move away. An elderly British couple nearby shook their heads in disapproval, and the woman whispered to her husband about young people having no respect these days. James remained perfectly still, but internally he was dealing with a complex mix of emotions. He felt annoyed and disrespected, but he also felt a strong sense of duty to maintain his professional demeanor. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make fun of him while he was on duty, and his training had prepared him to handle these situations without reacting. Marcus, interpreting James's continued stillness as either stupidity or a challenge to try harder, decided to escalate his performance. He started making funny faces directly in front of James, getting within just a few feet of him. "Hello? Anyone home in there? Can you see me? Maybe the hat is too big." He waved his hands in front of James's face and made exaggerated knocking motions as if he were knocking on a door. The crowd was getting larger now, with some people stopping to watch what they thought was harmless entertainment. Marcus was feeding off the attention, feeling more confident and clever with each laugh he generated from the audience. He started doing impressions of what he imagined the guards' training might have been like, using a ridiculous accent and barking out nonsensical commands. "Stand up straight, don't breathe, don't think, just stand there and look pretty." Marcus was really getting into his performance now, becoming louder and more dramatic. He started making jokes about the guard's hat, his uniform, and his apparent inability to respond to anything happening around him. What Marcus didn't realize was that his behavior was being observed by more than just curious tourists and passers-by. Several plainclothes security officers had been discreetly positioned throughout the area, and they had been watching his entire performance with growing concern. They were trained to assess potential security threats, and while Marcus might have seen his behavior as harmless fun, the security team was evaluating whether his actions could escalate into something more serious. James, meanwhile, was demonstrating exactly the kind of professionalism and self-control that had earned him his position. Despite Marcus's increasingly obnoxious behavior, he maintained his composure and continued to fulfill his duties. He was aware of his surroundings, monitoring the crowd for any actual security concerns, all while enduring what was essentially public humiliation. The situation was reaching a tipping point, though neither Marcus nor James fully understood what was about to happen. Marcus was so focused on entertaining his growing audience and proving his point about being able to break the guard's composure that he failed to notice the subtle changes in the crowd around him. Some people were becoming uncomfortable with his behavior. Security personnel were positioning themselves strategically, and the entire atmosphere was shifting from amusement to tension. James continued to stand at his post, fulfilling his duty with the same dedication he brought to it every day, unaware that his patience and professionalism were about to be rewarded in a way that would teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget. Marcus was really hitting his stride now, completely absorbed in what he believed was his comedic masterpiece. The crowd had grown to about 20 people, and he was playing to them like a seasoned performer. He had completely forgotten about his important work presentation and was entirely focused on his mission to break the guard's professional demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced dramatically, gesturing toward James with exaggerated showmanship, "we have here a genuine British robot. Watch as he demonstrates his amazing ability to do absolutely nothing while looking ridiculous." The crowd chuckled, and Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of reaction he lived for. He started taking selfies with James in the background, making funny faces and peace signs. "This is going straight to social media, buddy," he said loudly to James. "You're going to be famous. The guard who got totally owned by a random guy from London." Marcus was already imagining the viral potential of his video, picturing himself as an internet sensation. What Marcus didn't notice was that among the crowd, several people were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior. A middle-aged teacher who was chaperoning a group of school children quietly moved her students away from the scene. An elderly veteran who had stopped to watch shook his head in disgust and muttered something about disgraceful behavior before walking away. But Marcus was too caught up in his performance to read the room properly. He started doing what he thought were hilarious impressions of other royal guards, using ridiculous accents and making up silly scenarios. "Oh no, what if a pigeon lands on my hat? What if someone asks me a question? What if I need to go to the bathroom? He acted out each scenario with exaggerated panic, getting more laughs from some in the crowd. James, standing perfectly still throughout this entire ordeal, was demonstrating incredible self-control. His military training had taught him to remain focused on his duties regardless of external distractions, but this was testing even his well-developed patience. He could hear every word Marcus was saying, could see his mocking gestures in his peripheral vision, but he remained committed to his professional responsibilities. Marcus decided to try a different approach. He started asking James direct questions, in a loud voice, as if he were interviewing him for television. "So, Mr. Guard, what's it like being a human statue? Do you ever get bored just standing there? Are you actually a real person or just a very convincing mannequin?" He held his phone up like a microphone and waited dramatically for responses that he knew wouldn't come. The security officers who had been monitoring the situation were now communicating through discreet earpieces, updating each other on Marcus's behavior and assessing whether intervention was necessary. They had been trained to distinguish between harmless tourist antics and behavior that crossed the line into harassment or potential security threats. Marcus, oblivious to the growing tension around him, decided to up the ante even more. He started making fun of what he imagined the guard's personal life might be like. "I bet when you go home, you just stand in your living room all night. Do you eat dinner standing up? Do you sleep standing up? Maybe you're broken and someone forgot to tell you that you can move." Some people in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. What had started as light-hearted fun was beginning to feel mean-spirited and cruel. A young woman near the back of the crowd whispered to her friend, "This isn't funny anymore. He's being really nasty." Her friend nodded in agreement, and they both started to walk away. But Marcus was on a roll and completely missed these social cues. He started making jokes about the guard's appearance, his uniform, and even began speculating about his intelligence. "I don't think there's anybody home upstairs," he said, tapping his own temple dramatically. "Maybe they just hired a mannequin and hoped nobody would notice." James continued to endure this humiliation with remarkable grace and professionalism. Inside, he was dealing with a range of emotions: frustration, anger, and hurt. But his commitment to his duty remained unwavering. He had sworn an oath to serve with honor and dignity, and he wasn't going to let one person's cruel behavior compromise his integrity. The situation took another turn when Marcus decided to try physical comedy. He started pretending to trip and stumble dramatically near James, making exaggerated recovery gestures and looking around as if the guard should have helped him. "Thanks for the help, buddy. Really appreciate your concern for public safety." This was the moment when several things began to happen simultaneously. The plainclothes security officers recognized that Marcus's behavior was escalating and potentially becoming more problematic. His actions were no longer just verbal harassment, but were moving toward physical disruption of a guard's duties. At the same time, a distinguished-looking older gentleman who had been watching from the edge of the crowd began to walk purposefully toward the scene. He was wearing an expensive suit and carried himself with an air of authority that suggested he was someone important, though Marcus was too focused on his performance to notice. Marcus was now completely caught up in his own show, convinced that he was providing entertainment and proving his point about the ridiculousness of the Royal Guard tradition. He had no idea that his actions were about to trigger a series of consequences that would completely change his perspective on what he thought was harmless fun. The crowd was at its largest now, but the mood had definitely shifted. What had begun as light-hearted amusement had become uncomfortable for many observers. Marcus, however, was too intoxicated by his own performance to recognize that he had crossed a line from playful teasing into genuine harassment and disrespect. Marcus was reaching the peak of his performance when he noticed the distinguished older gentleman approaching. Instead of recognizing this as a potential warning sign, Marcus saw it as an opportunity to expand his audience. "Oh, look, we've got another spectator. Sir, would you like to witness the amazing statue man? He does absolutely nothing, but he does it very well." The older gentleman was Colonel William Harrison, a retired military officer who now served as a senior advisor to the Ministry of Defense. He had been walking through the area on his way to an important meeting when he noticed the commotion. As someone who had dedicated his entire career to military service and understood the honor and sacrifice that went into positions like Royal Guard duty, he was deeply offended by what he was witnessing. Colonel Harrison had served in multiple conflicts during his 30-year military career. He had seen young soldiers risk their lives for their country, had attended funerals for brave men and women who died in service, and had the highest respect for anyone who chose to wear a military uniform. Watching Marcus mock and humiliate a young guard who was simply trying to do his duty with honor made his blood boil. "Young man," Colonel Harrison said in a calm but commanding voice that cut through Marcus's chatter, "I think you've had quite enough fun for one day." Marcus, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, turned his attention to the colonel with a big grin. "Oh, come on, sir. Don't be so serious. I'm just having a bit of fun with our friend here. No harm done, right?" He gestured casually toward James, who remained at perfect attention despite the ongoing humiliation. "No harm done?" Colonel Harrison repeated, his voice carrying decades of authority. "Son, do you have any idea what this young man represents? Do you understand what he had to go through to earn the right to wear that uniform?" Marcus, still confident in his position, shrugged dismissively. "It's just a costume, isn't it? I mean, he's basically a tourist attraction. That's his job, right? To stand there and look fancy for pictures?" The colonel's jaw tightened, and several people in the crowd began to pay closer attention to the conversation. Something in the older man's demeanor suggested that this wasn't going to end the way Marcus expected. "That costume, as you call it, is a uniform that represents over 300 years of British military tradition," Colonel Harrison explained, his voice remaining controlled but growing more intense. "That young man has undergone months of rigorous training, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation. He has sworn an oath to serve his country with honor and dignity." Marcus rolled his eyes, still not grasping the seriousness of the situation. Okay, I get it. Very patriotic. But come on, he's just standing there doing nothing. It's not like he's in a war zone or anything. He's basically a very expensive scarecrow." This comment was the final straw for Colonel Harrison. His voice remained calm, but there was now steel in his tone that made several people in the crowd step back instinctively. "Son, I want you to understand something very clearly. This young man is currently performing his duty under extremely difficult circumstances. He is maintaining his professionalism and composure while you publicly humiliate and disrespect him." Marcus was finally starting to sense that maybe this wasn't going as well as he had hoped, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "Look, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just having a laugh. If he can't handle a few jokes, maybe he's in the wrong job." "Can't handle it?" Colonel Harrison's voice rose slightly. "Young man, he is handling it. He's handling it with more grace and professionalism than you've shown in the last 20 minutes. But just because he chooses not to respond doesn't mean your behavior is appropriate or acceptable." The crowd was now completely focused on the confrontation between Marcus and the colonel. Marcus's phone was still recording, but he had lowered it as he began to realize that he might be in more trouble than he had anticipated. Colonel Harrison continued, "This guard cannot respond to your taunts because he is bound by duty and honor to maintain his post. He cannot defend himself or tell you what he really thinks of your behavior because he has sworn an oath to serve something larger than his own ego." Marcus felt his confidence beginning to waver, but he made one last attempt to justify his actions. "It's just a bit of fun, mate. Everyone was laughing. It's not that serious." "Not that serious?" The colonel's eyes flashed. "Son, let me tell you what's serious. Serious is the commitment this young man has made to serve his country. Serious is the respect he deserves for that commitment. Serious is understanding that your bit of fun comes at the expense of someone who cannot fight back." The security officers who had been monitoring the situation began to move closer, recognizing that the situation was escalating and that they might need to intervene. Marcus noticed their approach, and for the first time, began to feel genuinely nervous about where this was heading. Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. I've spent 30 years in military service, and I've had the honor of serving alongside men and women who embody the same dedication and professionalism that this young guard is demonstrating right now. Your behavior isn't funny. It's a disgrace. Marcus looked around at the crowd and noticed that the mood had completely changed. The people who had been laughing earlier were now looking at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to disgust. He realized that somehow he had become the villain in this story, though he still couldn't quite understand how that had happened. The colonel stepped closer to Marcus, and his final words before the situation took its next dramatic turn would echo in Marcus's mind for years to come. Young man, you're about to learn that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences come faster than you expect. As Colonel Harrison's words hung in the air, Marcus noticed that the 3 security officers were now positioned strategically around him. What had seemed like casual observers were clearly professional security personnel, and they all had the same focused, serious expression that suggested Marcus's morning was about to take a very different turn. "Sir," one of the security officers said to Marcus in a polite but firm tone, "we're going to need you to come with us for a few questions." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Questions? What kind of questions? I haven't done anything illegal. I was just joking around." His voice had lost all of its earlier confidence and now carried a note of panic that he couldn't quite hide. "Sir, you've been harassing a member of the Royal Guard while he was performing his official duties," the lead security officer explained calmly. "This constitutes disruption of official proceedings and potentially harassment. We need to discuss this matter with you privately." The crowd, which had been watching with growing interest, now had their phones out recording this new development. Marcus realized with horror that his attempt to create viral content was indeed going viral, but not in the way he had intended. He was about to become internet famous as the guy who got arrested for making fun of a royal guard. Wait, Marcus said, trying to back away but finding his path blocked by another security officer. "This is ridiculous. People make jokes all the time. This is just political correctness gone mad." Colonel Harrison, who had been watching this development with satisfaction, stepped forward again. "Son, this isn't about political correctness. This is about basic human decency and respect. You chose to publicly humiliate someone who couldn't defend himself, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice." Marcus looked desperately at the crowd, hoping for support, but found only disapproving faces staring back at him. The people who had been laughing at his jokes 20 minutes earlier were now treating him like a pariah. A few were shaking their heads in disgust. Others were muttering comments about his behavior, and several had already walked away in embarrassment at having initially encouraged him. "This can't be happening," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I was just having a laugh. This is insane." One of the security officers placed a gentle but firm hand on Marcus's arm. "Sir, you can cooperate with us now, or we can make this more formal. The choice is yours." As they began to escort Marcus away, Colonel Harrison called out one final comment that would haunt Marcus for weeks afterward. "That young guard has been standing there for 2 hours in the heat, performing his duty with honor and dignity while you made a mockery of him for your own entertainment. I hope you'll think about that." Marcus was led to a security office in a nearby government building, where he spent the next 3 hours being questioned about his actions and their potential security implications. The officers explained that in the current security environment, anyone who disrupted official proceedings or harassed government personnel was taken very seriously. During those 3 hours, Marcus had plenty of time to think about what had happened. Sitting in a small, windowless room with nothing but his thoughts, he began to replay the morning's events from a different perspective. For the first time, he tried to imagine what it must have felt like to be James, standing at attention while being mocked and humiliated by a stranger. The security officers were professional, but made it clear that Marcus's behavior was unacceptable. They explained that the Royal Guards were highly trained military personnel who deserved the same respect as any other service member. They also mentioned that Marcus's entire performance had been recorded by security cameras, and that the footage would be reviewed to determine if any formal charges should be filed. But everyone was laughing, Marcus protested weakly. If it was so terrible, why was everyone enjoying it? Sir, one of the officers replied, just because some people laugh doesn't mean behavior is appropriate. Many people laugh when they're uncomfortable or don't know how else to react. That doesn't make harassment acceptable. As the hours passed, Marcus began to realize the full extent of his mistake. His phone had been confiscated during the questioning, so he couldn't see what was happening online, but he could imagine that the video of his arrest was probably spreading across social media. He thought about his friends, his co-workers, and his family seeing footage of him being led away by security officers. Even worse, he began to understand that his behavior hadn't just been inappropriate, it had been cruel. He had targeted someone who couldn't respond or defend himself, and he had done it purely for his own entertainment and ego. The realization made him feel sick to his stomach. When the questioning finally ended, Marcus was released with a formal warning and a citation for disrupting official proceedings. The officers made it clear that any similar behavior in the future would result in more serious consequences. They also informed him that he was now on a security watch list and would be monitored if he visited any government or royal properties. Walking out of the building in the late afternoon, Marcus felt completely defeated. His important work presentation had been missed, his reputation was likely in ruins, and he had learned some very hard truths about himself and his behavior. The confident, joke-cracking man who had approached the Royal Guard that morning was gone, replaced by someone who was deeply ashamed and confused about how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The worst part was that James, the guard he had mocked, was probably still at his post, continuing to serve with the same professionalism and dignity he had shown throughout Marcus's entire shameful performance. Marcus walked home in a daze, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. The London streets that had seemed so bright and full of possibility that morning now felt gray and unwelcoming. Every person he passed seemed to be staring at him, though he knew logically that was impossible. His paranoia was getting the better of him as he imagined his humiliation spreading across the internet. When he finally reached his apartment, Marcus immediately went to his laptop and began searching social media. What he found was worse than he had imagined. Multiple videos of his confrontation with Colonel Harrison and his subsequent arrest had already been posted and were gaining thousands of views. The comments were overwhelmingly negative, with people calling him everything from disrespectful to a complete embarrassment. One comment that particularly stung read, "Imagine being so desperate for attention that you'd humiliate someone who can't defend themselves. This guy is pathetic." Another said, "That guard showed more class in 10 minutes than this clown has, probably shown in his entire life." Marcus's phone, which had been returned to him when he was released, was buzzing constantly with notifications. His friends from the group chat were sending him messages, but they weren't the congratulatory messages he had expected. Instead, they were asking if he was okay and expressing shock at what they had seen online. His friend Jake sent a particularly painful message. "Dude, what were you thinking? That video of you getting arrested is everywhere. This isn't funny anymore, man. You really messed up." Even worse were the messages from his coworkers. His boss had sent him a text asking him to call immediately, and several colleagues had forwarded him links to the viral videos with messages ranging from concern to disappointment. But the message that hit him hardest came from his mother, who had somehow already heard about the incident. "Marcus, your aunt sent me a video that she says is you getting arrested. Please tell me this isn't true. Call me immediately." Sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his public humiliation, Marcus finally allowed himself to fully process what had happened. He began to understand that his actions hadn't just affected him, they had affected James, the guard who had been forced to endure his harassment while maintaining his professional duty. For the first time, Marcus tried to put himself in James's position. He imagined standing perfectly still for hours, fulfilling an important responsibility, only to have a stranger show up and mock him publicly for entertainment. He thought about how helpless James must have felt, unable to respond or defend himself because of his commitment to his duty. Marcus realized that what he had perceived as harmless fun had actually been a form of bullying. He had used his freedom to speak and move against someone who was bound by duty and honor to remain silent and still. The power dynamic had been completely one-sided, and he had exploited it for his own amusement. The next morning brought even worse news. Marcus's boss called to inform him that the company had decided to place him on unpaid leave while they assessed the situation. The viral videos had been linked to his workplace, and clients were expressing concerns about being associated with someone who had gained notoriety for such disrespectful behavior. "Marcus," his boss explained, "our company values respect and professionalism. Your actions yesterday don't align with our corporate values, and we need time to determine how to move forward." Over the following days, Marcus watched his life slowly fall apart. His story had been picked up by news outlets as an example of disrespectful behavior toward military personnel. Social media users had identified him and his workplace, leading to a flood of negative reviews and comments directed at his company. Several of his friends distanced themselves from him, not wanting to be associated with someone who had become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. His dating prospects disappeared overnight when potential matches found the videos and decided they didn't want to be involved with someone who had shown such poor judgment and character. But perhaps the most painful consequence was the disappointment he saw in his family's eyes. When he finally worked up the courage to visit his parents, his father, who had always been proud of Marcus's quick wit and humor, looked at him with a mixture of sadness and shame. "Son," his father said quietly, "I taught you to be funny, but I also tried to teach you to be kind. What you did to that young man wasn't funny. It was cruel. You used your words to hurt someone who couldn't fight back, and that's not the man I raised you to be." Weeks passed, and while the internet's attention eventually moved on to other stories, the consequences of Marcus's actions continued to affect his life. He struggled to find new employment, as background checks now revealed his viral infamy. His social life remained severely limited, and he found himself dealing with depression and anxiety as he faced the reality of how one moment of poor judgment had derailed his entire life. But slowly, very slowly, Marcus began to learn from his experience. He started volunteering with veterans organizations, trying to understand and honor the kind of service and sacrifice that he had mocked. He wrote letters of apology, though he never sent them, knowing that reaching out to James directly would likely cause more harm than good. Most importantly, Marcus began to understand the difference between humor that brings people together and humor that tears people down. He realized that true wit and humor should never come at the expense of someone who cannot defend themselves or respond in kind. 6 months after the incident, Marcus was working a part-time job at a local coffee shop while trying to rebuild his reputation and career. The pay was a fraction of what he had earned before, but it gave him time to reflect and work on becoming a better person. His co-workers didn't know about his viral infamy, and he was grateful for the chance to start over with people who judged him only on his current actions. One afternoon, a customer came into the coffee shop wearing a military uniform. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as memories of that terrible morning came flooding back. The soldier was young, probably around the same age as James, and Marcus found himself wondering if this person had friends or colleagues who served as royal guards. As Marcus prepared the soldier's coffee, He made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier. Instead of making jokes or trying to be the center of attention, he simply said, "Thank you for your service." The soldier looked surprised but smiled genuinely. "Thank you. I appreciate that." It was a small moment, but for Marcus, it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached interactions with others. He had learned to lead with respect rather than humor, to think about the impact of his words before speaking them, and to understand that real confidence comes from building others up rather than tearing them down. Marcus never forgot the lesson that James had taught him through his silence and professionalism. Though they never met again, the young guard's dignity in the face of humiliation had shown Marcus what true strength looked like. It wasn't the ability to dominate others with words or to make people laugh at someone else's expense. It was the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult, and the grace to maintain one's integrity under pressure. The viral video that had once been Marcus's source of shame became, in time, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserve. He learned that real humor comes from cleverness and creativity, not from making others feel small, and that the best way to earn respect is to give it freely to others. Marcus still struggled with the long-term consequences of his actions. The difficulty finding employment, the damaged relationships, and the ongoing reminder of his poor judgment that lived forever on the internet. But he also discovered something valuable in the wreckage of his old life, the opportunity to become a genuinely better person. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the incident that had made him briefly internet famous, he would tell them honestly about his mistakes and what he had learned. He became an advocate for treating service members with respect and often spoke to young people about the importance of thinking before acting, especially in the age of social media, where every mistake can become permanent. The Royal Guard, James Mitchell, continued his service with the same dedication and professionalism he had always shown. He never knew the full impact that his quiet dignity had on Marcus's life. But his example of grace under pressure had helped transform someone who had once mocked him into someone who now understood the true meaning of honor and respect. In the end, Marcus's attempt to humiliate a royal guard had backfired completely, but in that failure, both men had demonstrated something important about character. James, through his unwavering professionalism in the face of harassment, and Marcus through his eventual willingness to learn from his mistakes and grow into a better person. The instant payback Marcus had received that day had been swift and severe, but the lasting lesson about respect, dignity, and personal responsibility would stay with him for the rest of his life.